Assalamu alaikum, I'm Brother Ijaz Ahmed and welcome back to another Calling Christians video. Today we'll be looking at Jeremiah chapter 8 verse 8. This is a fairly popular verse used in the interfaith community, and I know that many Christians object to the Muslim use of this passage. Today, however, we'll be looking at this passage from multiple angles and then we'll qualify it with additional information. So let's read from the New English Translation. It says, "How can you say we are wise? We have the law of the Lord. The truth is, those who teach it have used their writings to make it say what it does not really mean." Now, perhaps it is Muslims can misunderstand this verse. I don't think that's the case, so let's continue to a different translation of the same verse. Here, I'm reading from a critical and exegetical commentary on Jeremiah, and it's written by Professor William McCain. When he wrote this commentary, he was the Emeritus Professor of Hebrew and Oriental Languages in the University of St. Andrews. Here's what he says. "How can you say we are wise men, and Yahweh's law is in our custody? Undoubtedly, it has been changed to falsehood by the falsifying pens of scribes." Now, let us look at an interlinear text of this passage. I'm reading from BibleHub.com. You can see the link is there in the image, and you can double check for yourself if this has been changed. So if you look at the very first line in the center of the page, it mentions "and the law," and the term used here is "and the Torah." So as we can see, the word Torah is directly mentioned. What if we take this word Torah as it is mentioned in the Hebrew and then put it back into the English translation? What is the result that we would get? So let's read this again. "How can you say we are wise men, and the Torah of Yahweh is in our custody? Undoubtedly, it has been changed to falsehood by the falsifying pens of scribes." Now, this changes the context a bit. We understand the emphasis of the passage, what it is actually communicating. It directly says that the Torah of Yahweh has been changed. So, as we can see, this is not this is not as a result of Muslim imagination or based on a conjecture. It's actually what the text reads word for word. But let's not stop there. What most Christians are unaware of, and I realized this from my conversations with them, is that they don't actually know that within Rabbinical Judaism, there is the teaching that the rabbis themselves edited the text of the Old Testament. Specifically, we're going to be reading from the Oxford Reference website, which is from the Oxford University Press. Let's see what it says. So it reads, "Tekun Soferim." Changes in the text of the Hebrew Bible. The rabbis attribute 18 tikkunim, which is plural, to the men of the great synagogue who changed the text because it showed a lack of respect to God. Now, you need to remind yourselves that throughout the Old and the New Testament, it mentions the scribes of the law. These scribes weren't random people. In fact, it's referring to a specific class of highly educated Jews whose purpose or occupation was to write the book of the law, was to write the Torah, was to transmit it in manuscript form. So here we can see that it's not speaking of random people, but people with the highest authority in Judaism, people in the highest echelons of Judaism. Now, the Tekun Soferim is limited in some places between 17 to 18 verses. However, what we can say is that we are aware within the manuscript tradition of other places outside of this listing where there are changes to the text. This is the variant in Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 43. Let's start from the first row. This is from the Masoretic text, which is the form of the text that most Jews use today. And the translation reads, "Call for songs of joy, O nations, concerning his people." And the translation used here is from the Lexham English Bible. Then, let's look at the second row. This uses the Greek Septuagint, or the translation or the form of the text which most Christians believe in. The translation, which is from the Lexham English Septuagint, reads, "Delight, O heavens, with him, and worship him, you sons of God." Delight, O nations, with his people, and prevail with him, all you angels of God. Here we can see that the text is much more expanded. Finally, let's read one of the variants from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is the last row or the third row in the table, and the scroll being referenced is 4Q Deuteronomy. It says, "Rejoice, O heavens, together with him, and bow down to him, all you gods." Here the word used is Elohim. So now we can see that there are changes to the Old Testament, significant changes which impact the meaning of the text. So this table is taken from the Lexa Methods Series Volume 1, Textual Criticism of the Bible by Wendy Widow. Here's what they say about this variant in the book. The presence of additional lines in both the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls, along with the quotation of this verse in Hebrews, makes it likely that something is missing from the Masoretic text. Christensen believes a line was omitted in the Masoretic text as a nomistic correction to prevent an angelological or polytheistic interpretation. The English translations differ in their treatment of this verse. While none completely follow the Septuagint, many translations do not follow the Masoretic text. Several translations like the ESV, the NRSV, NAB, and NLT use heavens instead of nations. These translations also include some form of the second line not found in the Masoretic text. The ESV and NRSV have "bow down to" or "worship him, all you gods," while the NAB and NLT include "angels" in the second line. Other English translations choose to follow the Masoretic text. Example, the NEB, the NKJV, the NASB, and the GNB. All this tells us is that yes, there were changes made to the text, that the Muslim understanding of Jeremiah chapter 8 verse 8 was actually correct all along, and it's not something that Muslims made up. Let us continue very quickly to what the Qur'an says on this matter. Now, here's what the Qur'an says in Surah 2, verses 78 to 79. I'm going to read the English translations. I'm using the translation by Dr. Mustafa Khattab, the Clear Qur'an, which I tend to prefer. Here's what he says for verse 78. "And among them are the illiterate who know nothing about the scripture except lies, and they wishfully speculate." Now, the word used, ummiyuna, tells us that these people were generally unlettered. They were illiterate people. That is what is said in verse 78. Now, verse 79 has something different. Let us continue to it. It reads, "So woe to those who distort the scripture with their own hands, then say this is from Allah, seeking a fleeting gain. So woe to them for what their hands have written, and woe to them for what they have earned." In the Arabic, the Quran says, "Yaktubuna al-kitaba bi-aydihim." So, they write the book with their very hands. This is what the Quran is referring to. The scribes, the people who were in charge of writing down the Torah. It's not referring to a book, it's Al-Kitab, it's the book. Not any book like the Talmud, for example, but the book. And there is only one book known as the book, the Torah itself, the law. And so the Quran specifies that these are not the people from verse 78, because as it mentioned, the people in verse 78 are illiterate. But the people in verse 79 write it with their own hands. That is, they are the scribes of the law. And so it specifies this terminology, which indicates to us it's not any random people, but the same people referred to in Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8. Some non-Muslims do bring up the question, what does the Quran then mean when it says none can change the words of Allah? Now, I understand that this is often brought up when Muslims refer to Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8. But the understanding that the non-Muslims have when they bring up this question, or this argument rather, is that they truly misunderstand that verse. I'll give you an example. If I were to recite the Quran now and I made a mistake in it, does that mean that I changed the words of Allah? No. What it means is I misquoted or I made a mistake in my recitation. That is not the same for what the Quran is referring to. So the Quran, in its reference of use in that passage, is to say that none can alter the commands or none can alter the metaphysical speech of Allah. That's simply what it means. It's not in reference to things which are what we would call the expressed word. That is what we recite and what we write. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more great content. Assalamu alaikum.